In this video, we're going to learn about market equilibrium and how prices are determined in the market. But we're going to start by going back and thinking about demand and supply we've already learned about. So this is a demand curve. It's the demand curve for potatoes, all the potatoes that are demanded in any month. And you can see that when the price is low at 20 pence per kilo, demand is very high, 700,000 tonnes of potatoes are demanded. But as the price goes up, we can see that demand falls to point B and then C and so on until we reach the price of 100 pence or £1 per kilo, and at that point demand has fallen right down to 100,000 tonnes. So remember, our demand curve is downward sloping because what it shows us is that as price goes up, demand falls. And how about supply? Well, the first thing we notice and perhaps remember about supply is that supply is not downward sloping like demand, it's upward sloping. And that's because when price is low, at point A there, we can see that only 100,000 tonnes of potatoes will be supplied at this low price of 20 pence. But again, as the price rises, the amount of potatoes that farmers are willing to supply to the market also rises. So again, as we get to this high price of £1 or 100 pence, the quantity of potatoes that farmers are willing to supply to the market in any one month has gone right up to 700,000 tonnes, because they know at this high price they can make lots of profit. So they decide maybe we won't grow carrots anymore, we'll grow potatoes. They've increased their supply because they're motivated by profit. So that's our demand and supply curves. Now that we're thinking about market equilibrium, we're going to put those two curves together. So we're going to be looking at equilibrium price and output and how supply and demand come together to determine price. We're going to look at what happens when there's a shortage of a surplus and that significance of that equilibrium. And we're going to also look at the signalling function of price, how prices send out a message or a signal to the market. So we've put supply and demand together here, and the first thing we notice is that these two curves cross. They cross at point C, don't they? At point C, if we read down the graph, we can see that at point C, 350,000 tonnes of potatoes are being both supplied and demanded. And that happens at this price of 60 pence if we read along the graph. So we see that at a price of 60 pence, supply and demand are equal. All the potatoes that are being supplied to the market are also being consumed, demanded by consumers because consumers are happy to pay that price of 60 pence. So, I mentioned signalling earlier. This is an important function of the price mechanism. So when prices change, that sends out a message or a signal to both consumers and to producers about whether to enter or leave the market. So think about it. A rising price sends a signal to us as consumers to reduce our demand. Maybe we'll decide not to buy potatoes anymore. Maybe we'll buy rice instead because potatoes are now expensive. On the other hand, that rise in price sends a signal to producers to say, we can make more profit now. So perhaps the farmer will decide not to plant carrots or cabbages, but instead to grow more potatoes to supply to the market because the price has risen and they can make more profit. But of course, the opposite is also true. When prices fall, that sends a signal to us as consumers to buy more potatoes. I'm going to stop buying the rice now, I'm going to eat potatoes instead. But equally, for producers, not such a good thing, because when prices fall, they can make less profit. So farmers will then think, well, maybe I won't grow potatoes. Maybe I'll go back to growing carrots because I can make more profit with them. So falling prices sends a signal to producers to reduce their supply. So let's have a look again at our diagram and examine more closely how that equilibrium price is set. So look again at point C and remember that that is our equilibrium point. It's the point where we have an equilibrium quantity, which is 350,000 tonnes, and it's the point at which we have an equilibrium price. Equilibrium equal, it's where supply and demand are equal. But supposing, for some reason, perhaps all the farmers got together and decided that they all wanted to raise their price to 80 pence per kilo to make more profit. Let's have a look. What happens there? Well, we can see we've got this new price marked on our diagram, but what we notice immediately that now supply and demand are no longer equal. The quantity that's demanded in the market has reduced. It's gone down from 350,000 to 200,000. As consumers, we don't want to pay that high price anymore. We've gone and we've bought rice or something instead. On the other hand, the quantity that's being supplied to the market has risen. Farmers want to supply more because the price is high, they can make a profit. So there's a big difference now between supply and demand, and that difference is a surplus. In this case, we have a surplus of 330,000 potatoes. So what are farmers going to do? They can either let those potatoes rot and get nothing for them at all, or they can do the sensible thing and they can decide to reduce the price. So what's happening here is that surplus has forced the price back down again to the equilibrium price of 60 pence. So we've talked about the signalling function of the price mechanism, but what we saw in our last diagram is that prices also provide an incentive for producers or consumers to change their behaviour. So as prices go up, existing producers, new producers will want to supply more because they can make more profit. On the other hand, consumers will want to buy less. So let's have a look at the opposite situation, where perhaps for some reason the price is lower. Perhaps the government says that the maximum price farmers can charge for potatoes is now 40 pence per kilo. What happens then? Well, again, the first thing we notice is that supply and demand are no longer equal. But now that the price has fallen, farmers no longer have that incentive to supply more. So they've reduced their supply because many of those farmers cannot make a profit at that price. So supply has reduced from 350,000 tonnes to 200,000 tonnes. On the other hand, for consumers, this drop in price is great. We all want to buy more potatoes, and so our demand has gone up to 500,000 tonnes. And what's the net effect of this? Well, now we have a shortage. We have a shortage of potatoes, and all the consumers are fighting with each other to buy those potatoes at this lower price. Well, again, what are the farmers going to think? Shall I carry on trying to decide who I sell my potatoes to? Or perhaps, if I possibly can, what I really want to do now is I want to raise my price. So these surpluses and shortages in the market will always force the price back towards equilibrium, where supply and demand become equal again. So we've talked about signalling, we've talked about incentive, but the price mechanism also has this function of rationing. When demand exceeds supply and consumers are fighting each other for the same good, what would happen naturally then is that the price will automatically go up, and that causes some consumers they're not able to buy anymore, and so that resource becomes scarcer and the price goes back towards the equilibrium again. So we've looked at diagrams. This is just a tabular version of the diagram. This is our demand schedule, and this shows us very clearly that when demand and supply are equal, that is our equilibrium price. So at a price of 60 pence, that is where demand is 350,000 tonnes and supply is also 350,000 tonnes. Every potato that is supplied to the market is demanded by consumers at that price, and that is the price where the market will settle. So that is our equilibrium price. And we see that here, how the forces of supply and demand are constantly pushing that price and the quantity back towards equilibrium. Okay, but we know, don't we, that markets are not static. There are changes constantly happening in the market, and we've seen in previous videos how lots of changes in the market can cause shifts in both demand and supply. So now we're going to have a look at how that affects price. So if there's a shift in demand, we know that the demand curve will shift, and that will cause a movement along the supply curve. A rise in demand, remember, causes the demand curve to shift to the right, and in that case, that will cause price to rise. A fall in demand, remember, will cause the demand curve to shift to the left, and that will cause the price to fall. And we can see that here. A rise in demand, the demand curve shifts to the right, and we can see what happens there is our equilibrium point has moved from point G to point I, and the equilibrium price has gone from PE1 to PE2, and our equilibrium quantity has increased from QE1 to QE2. So an increase in demand is going to cause a rise in price and an increase in equilibrium quantity. How about a shift in supply? So when the supply shifts, we get a movement along the demand curve. And just as we saw before, a rise in supply causes a rightward shift in the supply curve, and this will cause the price to fall. A fall in supply will cause the supply curve to shift to the left, and that will cause the price to rise. Opposite way round from demand, remember. So here we have it on our diagram, and what we're looking at here is a fall in supply. So the supply curve has shifted to the left, and again we see that's given us a new equilibrium. So the equilibrium has moved from point G to point K, and that has caused the price to rise from P1 to P3, and equally that has caused the equilibrium quantity to fall from QE1 to QE3. So that's the result of having that new equilibrium. So what have we learned? We've learned that equilibrium price is where supply and demand are equal. At this point, everything that is supplied to the market will be demanded. It's the market clearing price. Prices have a signalling function. They provide information to the market. If the price goes above the equilibrium, it acts as an incentive for firms to supply more, but also it acts as an incentive for consumers to demand less. So we get this surplus where supply is greater than demand, and that will force the price back down again. So when price is below the equilibrium, the incentive to supply is less, so supply will fall. The incentive to buy will rise, and so demand will rise. In this case, demand is greater than supply, and that creates a shortage, and this shortage forces prices up again. The rise in price acts as a rationing function. Demand will be limited to consumers who are willing and able to pay the higher price.